Welcome to this video. We'll discuss the intersection of current events with prophecy. And let us begin. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So recently, friends of mine had a podcast on another channel where they discussed the possibility of a civil war. And the context was a civil war in the United States. So the question was posed to me, do you think we will be in a civil war? And I want to point out that actually the Ukrainian-Russian war started with a civil war. And we'll talk about the United States and Europe as well. But I think that's an important context to understand how the Ukrainian-Russian war started. And when you talk about prophecy, Russia has always been central to the prophetic events at Fatima and also at Rushev as well. Our mother appeared in Rushev in Ukraine and spoke specifically about Ukraine and Russia. So the Russian and Ukrainian war started, actually, as I mentioned, a civil war in 2014. There was a coup that overthrew the democratically elected government in Kiev, Ukraine. And since then, there's been war in the East with Russian speakers. Now, I'm not going to try to place any blame, but what I do want to point out is that 8 years of civil war occurred in Russia and Ukraine, and no one did anything about it to stop it. As a matter of fact, it looked to me like the opposite occurred, where it was encouraged. So what we find ourselves in is that we're in a state of war, and war is spreading. What started as a civil war has turned into a full-fledged war where Ukraine has lost over 500,000 people. And I'm talking about soldiers, 500,000. And they're in desperate straits at this point. Also, we have the war in Israel. And in Israel, we might point to the fact that it started on October 7th. Now, I've always been a supporter of Israel, and actually, I thought positively of Netanyahu in Israel, but I don't do so anymore. I'm still a supporter of Israel. However, I believe that Netanyahu is engaging in practices which are self-serving, to say the least, where he's attempting to promote war there just to keep himself in power. And I definitely oppose the killing of innocent civilians that are Palestinian in Gaza, or innocent civilians anywhere for that matter. And there's an effort there to make this a larger war, to bring in other nations besides the Palestinians in Gaza, to bring in Iran, also neighboring states, and also Europe and United States. And the idea is to start a larger war to circumvent some of the issues that Netanyahu is facing in his home country of Israel and to stay in power. And I believe that is evil. And I don't support the genocide or mass killing of civilians in Gaza. So how does that fit into prophecy? Well, Marie Julie Johenney believes that the war would start in the Middle East with Iran. And, of course, we know that there is a bitter conflict between Israel and Iran. And it could have been much worse. I believe, except for the intervention of the United States and Europe, trying to ameliorate a much more substantial conflict that could have occurred between the two nations. And these are two nations that have a lot of powerful armament. So that is the backdrop of our discussion today. And we have other hotbeds across the world. And before we move on to the circumstances in Europe and the United States, I'd like to point those out. And one is a very old conflict that could reemerge in eastern Turkey, or the borders of eastern Turkey with Armenia and Azerbaijan, where we have border conflicts there. Again, conflicts that go back many centuries. And also there's potential conflicts between Greece and Turkey, also in the Balkan states, which are right in the same area. So you can see all those that I mentioned are in a hotbed of potential conflict. And let's not forget the potential in the Asian coast, on the eastern Asian coast of the Pacific, where we have Taiwan and also North Korea. So going to some of the recent events in Europe, and before we discuss those in particular, again, the context is prophecy. The prophetic context is that the errors of Russia, according to Fatima, has already spread throughout the world. So what's the implications of that in Western Europe? And I think we've seen them rather clearly over this last election cycle. So we have what surprised many in France, a leftist government. It's actually a split government, but most of the majority of the votes went to the left, the far left. And it looked like, predictably, that the populists were going to win, or as they term it in European parlance or European propaganda, the far right. One of the things I like to speak to is it was not a surprise to me at all. And the reason being is that what they refer to as a centrist government, which is Macron's government, is not centrist at all, is actually part of the left. So it did not surprise me that they united with the far left over there and tried to prevent the victory of what they would consider to be the right. Now, something similar happened in the UK as well, where you have Keir Starmer, and there's a rumor in the United States that he's actually from the cast of Monty Python. And I'm joking with my friends over there in the UK. But there's also another rumor that his father was a tool maker. Again, I'm just kidding. That's a term he used during his campaign. So how was that like France? Well, he's a leftist, and there was a big victory of the left in the UK. And again, not a surprise. So what happened? Why is that similar to France? Well, what you saw there, and it's very similar to France, is an implosion of what they consider to be the center, which was represented by the Sunak government. Just like you saw, like Macron's government, he actually would have came in third place. But uniting with the left, they managed to keep out what they considered to be the right government, far right government. And in the UK, the populace of the UK began to believe and understand that this centrist government was not centrist at all. So they felt betrayed by this government because they could not correlate the policies that they thought they'd adhere to and their actions. And the reason being, again, they're not centrist. They're also leftist. So one of the problems that we have in today's political environment is that, and this is due to the spread of the errors of Russia, we have a different circumstance. We have a overdrop or an overhanging, we have overhanging implications from the global environment and the global bureaucracy. The global bureaucracy is leftist. It's not centrist. It's authoritarian leftist. And you can see that in how they treat sovereign nations within the EU. And Hungary was just a perfect example. You have this gentleman, Viktor Orban. He visits Ukraine and he visits Russia, trying to establish some peaceful negotiations between the two. And they threaten to take away his voting rights. And it's crazy that they would do that to a sovereign nation, these unelected bureaucrats in the EU and NATO. There's no way that they should be able to possess the power that they believe that they have. And it's almost a power, an extortion type of power that they use against these sovereign nations. How should we look at political environments today? And it includes the United States as well, with the backdrop of globalism. Well, what we have today is we have a difference, a political difference, not between the left and the right. It's a difference between the left and populism. So you think about the populism as it applies to Europe, as an example. Some of the policies that we have across Europe, such as the promotion of illegal immigration, does that represent the will of the people? I think if we had an unbiased poll of the people in Europe that asked the question, do you favor that we stop or severely curtail the illegal immigration into your country? What do you think the answers will be? What do you think that poll would look like? Well, a vast majority will say yes to either stopping altogether or severely curtailing it. So how does policies, open border policies, which reject the will of the people, where do they come from, if not from the people themselves? Well, they come from this, again, this authoritarian left bureaucracy that is basically asserting itself over the will of sovereign nations in the EU. And that is exactly what the implications are for the spread of the errors of Russia. Just like you have unelected bureaucrats that were running things in the Soviet Union, you have that now in the EU, whereas like to call it the European Soviet Union, the ESU. So we have something similar in the United States. And in the United States, we have a circumstance that is quite evident where we have the attempt to persecute political opposition. And also we recently had political violence that everyone is well aware of. We've had a debate between the two major candidates where the current president appears to be someone who is not capable of being president. And it was evident to many people, and there was an attempt to hide it, which is, again, it's another manifestation of what I just spoke about. They're trying to hide the fact that this person was incapable of being a president for years. Just didn't happen during the debate. And it wasn't a matter of having a bad 90 minutes during the debate. All of his 90 minutes are bad, and they're not going to get any better. In the United States, you see this power-hungry, authoritarian left reveal itself in the aftermath of this debate, where their concern is not the fact that we don't have a president who's capable, not the fact that we have no one who's leading this nation. We have no one making the decisions and representing the people. That's not their concern. Their concern is, how do we maintain power? How do we hold on to power? What can we do? Can we move him out of the way and put someone else there? Because we're heading into elections in November, and that's their main concern. Their only concern. They don't care about the country. They don't care about the people. They only care about their power. And that is a characteristic of the authoritarian left, regardless of whether it's in Europe, the United States, the ex-Soviet Union, doesn't matter where it is. That's their main concern, power. And it's going to be very interesting because I don't feel like they have a chance to win. They're desperate. As I mentioned, they don't care about democracy. They don't care about the laws. They don't care about the people. They're like an animal that's cornered. And I'm a bit concerned for not just this nation, but we're also a world power. So I'm concerned in the upcoming months of what could occur. Some might think that it's a stretch saying that this is a result of the spread of the errors of Russia. Well, let's take a look at the current circumstances that we live in, especially as it pertains to our faith. So do you believe that our faith has not suffered, say, over the past 50 years or so? Look at the state of the church. And I'm going to talk about Europe to start. So I see some reports and discussions about some of the statistics of churchgoers where they say in certain nations, certain Western nations, that churchgoers are about 5%. Now, 5% is abysmal. It's like a candle at the end of its wick, just flickering out. Also, some of the stats, which may surprise people in the United States, is that churchgoers consider themselves churchgoers if they go to church once a month, not weekly, which is the habit of those in the United States. I look at that and I think, well, what do you go to church when you're not busy? You have nothing to do that Sunday? And what kind of way is that to keep the day of the Lord? It's not the day of the Lord at all. It's the day of when you feel like going. That's not being a churchgoer. And I don't care what the custom is there or what the custom has become recently. If you're going to church even just once a month, I mean, that's terrible. That's abysmal. Get yourself to church every week. And the United States isn't much better. We're closing churches. Churches are half empty and worse, consolidating churches. So why is that relevant? Well, we're passing laws in Europe and United States that are contrary to the commandments, contrary to the faith as we've known it for the past 2,000 years. And that, my friends, is the errors of Russia being embraced by the Western nations and being imposed upon the populace, again, that do not want it. So you could look at this as the worst of times and the best of times. And it is the best of times because we have a lot of reason for hope. And in the midst of this darkness, there is a great grace being given to all of us who maintain the faith, to all of us who strive and hope in our Lord. And one is the great gift of the divine will. And we also have some prophecies about the warning that is yet to come. And as you know, the warning is something that's been discussed widely at Garabandal. What many people don't know, it was also a prophecy by Marie-Julie Johenney about the warning. For those who may not know what the warning is, just briefly, the warning is going to be similar to you standing before the Lord. It's like a mini private judgment that will occur quickly no matter where you are. And it's something that's been prophesied by saints and also, as I mentioned, specifically and notably at the Garabandal Marian apparition. So at the Garabandal, one of the seers, Marie Loli, said that it will occur approximately 1 year before the miracle, which is also another event that is widely prophesied. And she said more specifically later that it would be either 3 weeks or 3 months before the miracle. This is actually corroborated by Marie-Julie Johenney, who says that the warning will occur in the first few months of a year. And we don't know what year, but that is how it will occur. What we do know is that Conchita Gonzalez will announce the miracle, and everyone believes that these events are not that far away. So we have a great hope for the intervention of our Lord. And it's something that Pope John Paul II spoke of frequently. He foresaw a new Pentecost, which is similar to this intervention that I'm speaking of. And actually, it is one and the same. Luisa Piccarreta also is something that's come up recently. And I feel like these attacks are also evidence that we're close to what we just discussed. And the fact is that what we have in the writings of Luisa is a great gift from God. It's an answer to the prayer of our Father. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And there's no doubt about that. So I'm someone who's not just read the writings, but I've lived and experienced this gift that Luisa speaks of. And I can tell you, despite some of the people who are coming out and attacking this great saint, and she is a great saint, there's no doubt that she is a saint. She is someone who has lived on the Eucharist for decades, on the Eucharist alone for decades, a victim soul who has great spiritual gifts. She has 4 spiritual marriages, unbelievable sanctity. She was also a person who lived at the same time as Padre Pio. Padre Pio was well aware of her. And today I think she lives, I looked it up once. I never traveled it, but I looked it up, and she lived about an hour and 15 minutes away from where Padre Pio resided in San Giovanni Rotondo. So he was well aware of Luisa Piccarreta, And actually, there were people who were familiar to both Luisa and Padre Pio. So the reason why I bring Padre Pio up is he actually read one of the writings we know of Luisa, and it was the Hours of the Passion, which have multiple imprimaturs of the church. And also, he said to have read it 3 times to one of his spiritual children who documented that, and it appears now in a book. Also, for people who came from where Luisa lived in Corato to see Padre Pio, he would ask the question, why are you coming to me when you have Luisa? So he was well aware of this spirituality, and he actually promoted the publication of the writings during his lifetime, something that, again, a lot of people don't know. And also there was St. Annabelle de Francia. St. Annabelle de Francia was her confessor. It was canonized not that long ago. He also promoted her writings and provided the imprimatur for the first 19 volumes of her writings. So the cause is not terminated, according to some people who believe that it is. The cause is still there. There's theological questions, and there are theologians that are attempting to answer these questions. So there's no official promulgation from the DDF or the Vatican that the cause has been terminated. So don't worry about that. But there is this question regarding some of the theological elements of her writings. Now, during the course of the cause, theologians from the Vatican also reviewed all the writings and found nothing contrary to faith and morals, despite the fact that there are some people, who I've not mentioned any names, who wish to slander these writings. I would say, who are you? Who are you to go against the Vatican's determination? Who are you to go against people like Padre Pio and also St. Annabelle de Francia, who knew these writings intimately and who knew Luisa Piccarreta, at least her spirituality, intimately as well? So please find some humility and also realize you're not the magisterium. You're not the walking, talking magisterium of the church. But please make an attempt to follow it. So there's been attacks against Luisa, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit, from different corners of the church. One, there's an attack that I just alluded to from what they would term to be the traditionalist, which I don't really like to use that term. I go to the traditional mass myself. I'm from a traditional religious order, spirituality of Carmel. I'm also an oblate of the Benedictine order, and I attend mass with the Capuchins, which is a traditional mass. So I know a little bit about tradition. And one of the problems I see with some people who believe themselves to be the remnant is that they also believe themselves to be outside the true magisterium. So they look at, and some of them are sedevacantists, which is, again, something that I believe is wrong to take that point of view. But they look at the writings of Luisa and look at it as something new. Now, it's not new. Luisa was born in the 1800s, but it's new to them. So they look at something as something outside tradition because they look at that as something new to them. So they reject it. They don't understand it. They don't understand the writings, and they probably never read it. And they get their opinion from someone maybe who scanned the writings. Then they come out with these negative opinions. Well, again, now, who are you people that would go against a magisterium and go against saints? So if you have a question about the writings themselves, ask somebody. there's plenty of people who've read the writings, understand them intimately, and are willing to answer questions. And that's what's happening with the cause. Now, the other side of it is, well, we have people who say, well, Luisa is too traditional, oddly enough. Too rigid, I think, was one of the theological points. So I kind of view that as, what is too rigid? Does that mean that she conforms to the magisterium? She's so rigid, she won't allow you to be a heretic? Is that rigid? And I think it is. So they look at someone who adheres to the teaching of the church, and unfortunately, we live in a time of apostasy. So we have many who say they're in the church, but really don't follow its teachings. They believe that someone like Luisa, who's promoting this spirituality, which is a love for the divine will of God, is rigid. And maybe they don't like the fact that there's some references to Mary, who was very prominent in these writings and referred to as the mediatrix and the co-redemptrix. And they may disagree with that. And they may feel like and maybe they're the false ecumenical heretics that maybe feel more comfortable with heretics within the Protestant sects. So guess what? Jesus disagrees with you and refers many times to his Blessed Mother and Luisa's writings as a co-redemptrix and a mediatrix of grace. And why? Because that's the way he wants it. That's his will. It's the will of God that she has this role. So it's up to God, not you, to make that determination. So I kind of spoke rather freely here regarding Luisa, some of the attacks. And I started out by mentioning that I'm someone who not only has read Luisa's writings, but I also have practiced them. And I'm certain that they are true. There's no doubt in my mind. I've experienced that in my own life. And I know for a fact there are only two types of faithful that exist. There are those who embrace the divine will of God as freely offered very generously by our Lord, and there are those who do not yet embrace it. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining. And as always, God bless.